Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second panel discussion in the Elevate Artist series. I'm Ellen Sturm Niz, director of Amos Eno Gallery, a nonprofit artist-run gallery that's been in continuous operation for more than 50 years in New York City. And we're pleased to be hosting this career development series, supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Amos Eno Gallery has 25 member artists from all over the United States, and one of those artists, Julianne Nash, whose solo show Flora Non Grata opens at Amos Eno on June 20th, is monitoring our Q&A feature tonight. If you have any questions for our panelists, please type them into the Q&A, and we'll reserve time at the end of the session to address as many of your questions as we can. Our goal tonight is to give emerging and mid-career artists real-world advice from the people shaping the art world today: curators, gallerists, editors, advisors. So let's dive in and introduce our panelists for tonight. One of our panelists is Maximilíano Durón, senior editor of ARTnews. Another of our panelists is Nora Lawrence, executive director of Storm King Art Center. And our third panelist is Anwarii Musa, founder of ArtMatic Advisory and board member of the Queen's Museum. Welcome to them all. They can hop on with their video and audio whenever they get a chance. Welcome, Nora and Max. Musa's running a little bit behind schedule this evening, but we hope he's able to join us soon. So everyone just stay tuned. Max, I'm going to start with you tonight. When we were chatting last, you had some great advice about how artists can better present themselves and their work to the media for coverage. Could you share some more about that?
Yeah, as a journalist and editor, I talk a lot with artists, curators, every day in my role. And, I think the best advice I can give is really knowing how to be able to speak about your work as an artist. I think that's so important. And in ways that I think are, outside of, art speak and jargon and stuff, just really accessible ways. And one example I gave is, in my experience, the artists who all have an amazing conversation, and perhaps in that conversation or at a later point, I'll learn that, one of their experiences was that they had a role in an education department at a museum or some other arts nonprofit or institution. And I think that what that shows is that, these places, give you a real training ground, the education departments at museums, to help you speak not only about your own practice, but about other artists' practice in ways that are, at various levels. And I think that really helps to understand how people will be coming to your artwork at all levels, whether it's, people in the art world, whether it's, docents who are retired, who, have some connection to art, children, high school students, and everyone that falls outside of those categories. It's super important to be able to know how to speak about your art in a way that will get the message across that you're trying to get across in a way that's, I think, accessible to different people. Obviously, art in many ways can speak on its own and should speak on its own, but there's so much goes into your art as an artist and into the practice and into the craft. And I think one of those things is knowing how to speak about it so that people can really understand your point of view and kind of how you're tackling whatever challenges you're tackling within your practice.
Do you think that artists feel like they need to use some of the jargon because that indicates that they're part of the club and that they know what they're talking about, but actually that's doing the opposite?
I think there's some pressure on that. I mean, it's an ongoing joke, maybe perhaps just among journalists, that, a lot of gallery press releases are just written in a bunch of art speak that, you know, this is pre-ChatGPT, but at this point seems like ChatGPT would have written it. And I think that, just being, authentic about kind of where you're coming from is the best way. And yeah, I personally don't use a lot of jargon in my writing and in the articles that I edit as an editor. ArtNews has a very distinct point of view that's more accessible in that sense, and so that's why we don't do that. But I do think that, being able to speak clearly about what it is you're trying to say when a journalist asks you a question about your work is kind of where you'll see, you know, really great quotes in a finished piece and kind of how a journalist might structure their piece around those quotes and really just help convey your message in the best way possible.
Do you think artists should think about, like you were saying, talking to different audiences of people, kind of work out how would they describe their art to a classroom that was visiting the gallery where their exhibition is happening? How would they describe it to an adult who's not part of the art world? How would they describe their work? And then also, how would they describe it to someone who does have a huge, an art history PhD who has a ton of knowledge and wants to have those references so they can have different ways of, getting people into the conversation?
Yeah, I definitely think knowing who your audience is for a given conversation is super important. I mean, if you're speaking to, someone who's writing for, a journal, an academic journal or art forum versus, the New York Times or ArtNews, it's very different audiences with very different kind of purposes in terms of what stories they're trying to deliver. But I also think, going to a museum, whether or not you work in their education department, kind of during the day when school visits are happening, it's really fascinating to kind of see how people within education departments kind of work with the students who are there and kind of engaging. I was recently at the Philadelphia Art Museum and witnessed one of like a high school group going through the show and respond, being asked questions about the art. And I actually learned a lot from kind of what they were seeing and what they were being probed about, and like spending the time with the work that they were seeing in ways that I might not have as someone who's used to going through exhibitions very quickly and all of that.
And what kinds of artist stories or practices do you find most compelling to write about at Art News, and how can artists position themselves to be part of that conversation?
That's a tricky question. I mean, I think every writer, and editor has their own kind of taste and aesthetic that's quite subjective. For me personally, in my writing, I focus on artists of color and queer artists and their intersections and really delving into, issues that I think are most concerning to those communities. I mean, right now it feels like, the border is a super important thing to talk about. But I've been writing about artists who engage the US-Mexico border for over a decade. It's not a trend for me. I think that's important to say. But I think it's, just like what motivates you as an artist, I think is always the most important thing to stay true to, as opposed to kind of what the media will cover. I mean, a lot of the artists I've written about in my career are, my elders who have been making art for 50 to 60 years, at the point that I interviewed them, and who had never really gotten a serious profile from an art magazine. And they were just making the work that they wanted to make, that they felt was necessary for them to make, that was how they could best express their unique points of view. And I think that's super important. I think, part of why we see this so-called rediscovery trend in the art world right now is that a lot of people from the mainstream art world are catching up to what these artists have been doing for decades that has actually been very prescient and, important and can really make us change how we view the world. And I think that's, one of the most important goals of great art is to shift our perspective.
How does an artist, like you're talking about, who has maybe been making art for decades but hasn't received that profile in the past, how do they get on your radar? What has led you to find them?
Um, you know, I will be honest, I'm not someone who scrolls Instagram for new artists. I would say I probably get over 100 press releases for exhibitions around the world every day. So it's a lot to comb through. I try my best to comb through it. I try to see art, in New York and in the cities that I travel to. I'm fortunate enough to, travel somewhat around the world. Just really monitoring kind of what's going on at museums whose programs I find interesting, curators who I find interesting. Um, but I often get cold calls or, cold emails from people who I don't have a connection with who think the work might resonate with me. And, sometimes it really does. And I think it's just a matter of, um, I think part of kind of how this is like outside the artist territory, but kind of like how, you know, PR and marketing and all of that works is often, finding the right writer for the right story. And I think that that's kind of what artists might want to think about, is who's a writer you read? Who do you think would actually be able to tell the story of your practice in the best way and trying connecting with them as opposed to, casting a very wide net, especially if you haven't gotten traction, and see what comes out of that. That would be my advice.
I think that's great. Nora, turning to you, you were talking about how artists approach you at Storm King, and what are some of the things that you can highlight about when an artist approaches you and they really stand out and you think, this is someone I want to work with?
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks for having us. And Max, it's lovely to be here with you. And Musa, I know will join us soon. So I thought so much of what you were saying, Max, I think really does hit home. I totally agree. And I think part of it, I was thinking about this because I was actually having a discussion with an artist just kind of about this on a personal scale earlier today. And I think remember that the person you're dealing with is also a person, right? Like just first of all treating it with kind of a human element, because I think, as Max is saying, I think that's a really good point that stands out for so many different um kind of threads within what we're talking about within this world. Just finding the right journalist for the right story, right? Or kind of learning a bit about who you're talking to and thinking about where they might be coming from. I mean, it's almost just human nature, right? Like, where is this person I'm talking to coming from, and what might also be on their mind? What types of things might they be thinking of? How can I kind of anticipate um, how to help in this conversation between, often two strangers? Um, I had one thing. So Storm King is we're a 500-acre outdoor museum and sculpture park in the Hudson Valley. We don't only show large scale sculpture, but we show a lot of large scale outdoor sculpture. And I did, for instance, I did studio visits once with an MFA program, and I did studio visits for the whole day. And actually, I kind of really enjoyed myself, but I only saw painters. And, they'd set me up only with painters. And then the person who set it up at the end, I was leaving and she said, well, I knew you were from Storm King, so I set you up with all the painters. And I kind of want to go back and ask, like, what was that? What were you talking about? Was that kind of like you wanted to give me a different experience, or you got everything backwards? It was very funny, but it does speak to this idea of just kind of understanding what the types of possibilities in a place might be, and how you might help that person understand where you're coming from and what some connective links might be. One thing that I've had happen to me also that I think, just thinking about Max's points about communication, which I think are so key. Um, I've often, not often, but I've had some visits where I think there can be this idea about kind of the purity of the artwork, and its ability to communicate for all of us and kind of take the place of, a conversation. And I've done some studio visits where the artist just kind of doesn't want to say anything about the work. And there are ways in which I can appreciate that, but it would be helpful in those cases to know sort of what the purpose of the visit is, because if the purpose of the visit is to let the person who visited know kind of where you're coming from and what your work is about, that's not a great approach. If the purpose of the visit is to kind of get a critique, right? Like more like grad school or something, that makes sense to me. but it can create kind of a sense of discomfort, and I don't think it's productive. So I think, sort of knowing the audience. Am I answering your question, Ellen?
I think so. I think
Okay.
so.
Okay.
And I
I,
think, yeah, doing your research and knowing like what do they want? I can see an artist being like maybe afraid to say something that they want the art to speak to you, and you go, "Oh, I really love this because it will fit into the show I'm doing about XYZ." And they're like,
That'd be
"Not
great.
why I made it, but sure." Um, but yeah, you want to hear their perspective. And I'm sure, I mean, people can look on your website and see the things that you've done before, but that might not be, how can they see what you might be looking forward to doing in the future as opposed to thinking like, oh, well, they did a show on, I don't know, blanking
Yeah,
flower,
sure. Yeah.
something last year. So last spring, so
Yeah.
another spring flower show next year or whatever.
There have been cases of that, um, in particular because, to work outside, either there's some reason, you live on a farm, or have a lot of big pieces of metal around your studio because you're right next to, a machinist or something. I don't know. Most artists don't have an opportunity to work outdoors unless or until there's an invitation to work outdoors. So a lot of what we do, working with emerging art, when we work with emerging artists, we're not often kind of borrowing works. We're often working with an artist to make new work. So it can be extremely helpful for an artist to kind of have an idea, because I mean, when we do this, it's generally in a series called Outlooks. And, if I'm talking to somebody about that, I mention that and I say, it's a series. We do this almost once a year. And I say some things like that. And I've gotten proposals that have been very close to things we've already done. And I think that also can feel hard, because it feels like the type of work that maybe should have already been done if it's a serious conversation. Um, but I think, what I'm interested in doing from the start is hearing as much as I can from an artist about how they frame their work. Sure, I'll have other interpretations, and I will share those. And I think that can just be also interesting and hopefully helpful to hear. But I really want to hear from the artist, and it's a privilege to do what I do and be in that space and get to hear from the artist, whoever that artist is. And so I want to be respectful of that, but also, um, I say it even if I'm in a studio of somebody very established who I know pretty well. I do say, like, I would love to hear how you explain this, because I've never gotten to have that before. And I think it can speak a lot to where points of intersection might be.
If an artist you don't already have a connection with or a relationship with wants to reach out to you for outlooks or some
Mhm.
other, call that you're doing or potential show at Storm King, what is the best way to reach out to you, and what is the short, I'm assuming, information that you want that you want to hear from them?
Yeah. I think I do think that examples of work and kind of an idea of why they're reaching out to this institution, it can be me or it can be the institution overall. I don't need them to know sort of my work specifically. Um, but I think those things, I am really interested in the artist's voice, and, sending me, if you've ever done an interview with someone, that's what I'm going to read first. I'm going to look at a lot of work, and if that work can also been thinking also about just, different panels I've been on for residencies and such, the more those works can be clear, not only if they need more clarity than just the photos show, that can be great, but showing kind of like a wide variety of work, and also what you've been up to recently. If everything is from, a burst of activity 8 to 10 years ago, that can be harder. Um, but, what have you been up to in the past 2, 3 years?
Max and Nora, for both of you, I think one of the things that emerging and mid-career artists struggle with is that they don't have that gallery representation. They don't have that PR person who's helping them with all of these, outlook, reaching out things that they're trying to do with both galleries, museums, institutions, the press. Um, Trying to juggle being creative versus being their own PR person can be, a really difficult thing to do. What would you suggest that they partner with another artist friend and interview each other? So maybe if it's not an article that is published somewhere, but at least they're kind of getting something, um, another take on it and having a way to present themselves that's not just them kind of in a box in a room by themselves trying to figure
Sounds
out how
like
to
good
present themselves.
practice, actually, also, right? Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, Max, what do you think?
Um, I think back a lot to kind of artists of previous generations who, when they felt like their work wasn't being covered, ended up writing their own scholarship, what would become the foundations of scholarship before, specifically within like, the Chicano Latino community, the Black community, the Asian American community. There's so many collectives that have formed. And I think that's, even interviewing each other, kind of providing that scholarship with artists you're friends with who share either a similar kind of outlook or whose practice perhaps is very different, but from that contrast and tension and the different approaches, something beautiful, I think, can totally emerge within that conversation. In terms of, not having gallery representation or PR, I think that's definitely a hard, balance to find. Unfortunately, I do think, setting aside some time for, the administration of the studio practice is, important. And it is a reality of kind of how the art world operates today. The art world's gotten so big, there's so many artists, there's so many gallery shows, there's so many museum exhibitions to see, that it can be overwhelming. But I think, being your own best promoter is great. And, I think as Nora said, having documentation of your artwork, I think is just one of the most important things because art is so visual and, oftentimes people can't get to certain places. Just having those photographs, whether or not, they're the highest quality professional photographs or, decent ones with, some good lighting, I think will, go a long way in it. I mean, you hear all the time about, you know, collectors and curators who discover artists on Instagram via those ways. But yeah, that's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as we're talking and thinking that if artists are partnering together to maybe interview each other or have a conversation about art and talk about their own art and along a different the same theme or different themes, maybe artists a photographer and a sculptor could pair together and the sculptor could write an article about the photographer and the photographer could photograph the sculptor's work. Like you could really create a symbiotic relationship and then they both have something that they can present to people when they're reaching out. And like you mentioned, Max, there's often a gap between artists creating great work and being actually that great work actually being seen. How much so both you and Nora, how much on social media websites are you finding artists or seeing things that way that are you're finding an artist that you're going to work with or profile versus through connections that you already have?
Hmm. Um, I can't think of anything that I've seen first on Instagram.
Okay.
I can think of I recognize that this answer is not that helpful because it implies that, I guess I can think of many things that I've seen in a group show and taken a picture of, and I sort of take pictures of what I see. I take pictures of the press release or whatever, even just the wall text, and then I will look things up, and then I'll end up on a lot of artist websites. And just sharing information, right? And not being overly almost esoteric about things, I think is just in your benefit. And also just to the point of, since we're talking presumably to some people who are at early moments in their career, photographing your work and having that faith in yourself that your work should be photographed and should be kind of taken seriously in that way is really important to do for yourself. Archiving kind of what you've made, when you made it, what it's made of, if it, if it's a lucky situation or wonderful situation, and it ends up in a collector's um, collection, writing down where that is, like giving your future self the benefit of having all that information is so amazing. So just, do that too. But also I think having that level of confidence, is not just about, that your work is worth this, right? And worth this history, but also that you are, you're gonna get a lot of, probably more frequently than no's, you're gonna get a lot of people who don't write you back. And it's kind of, I think you have to both expect that, and you have to present yourself in ways that don't mean that you've put yourself out monetarily, you've, invested a whole day in doing something that's a presentation for one person. Take things seriously, but allow also the respect for yourself that will kind of let you do, I love that idea of like an administrative hour or something, Max, but something, smaller and reasonable that can fit for you, and not, you cannot invest too much in one place or person, because it really might not come back the way that you wanted, and you know you can't have that for yourself.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. You have to take care of yourself and not take it so personally, because as Max said, and Nora, I'm sure you and everyone else at Storm King, you're getting hundreds and hundreds of emails a day, and it's just a numbers game at some point, and it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
Nora, I thought what you said was interesting about finding people in group exhibitions. For many artists, having a solo show is, obviously a great thing, but group shows can also be really important. And do you find that you find just as many artists in group shows as you do in solo shows?
I think so. I think that, it doesn't always happen this way. It happens a lot of other ways too, but I think that's definitely something that's happened. I think there's also something about solo shows that if it's at another nonprofit institute, that often means I can't do a solo show with you right away. If you're located in kind of the same region that my institution's in, I think great opportunity to reach out to people around the country and say, like, I'm in a solo show here. And I think that, also remembering, sorry, one point that, maybe this isn't that directly related, but like a lightness of touch, and just remembering that life is long, and that relationships are things that can benefit you in ways that you don't know now. Um, just I don't burn bridges with people because you thought that something was happening and it turned out not to be. Just, it's a lot of making sure you've got a strong sense of self, and can't be bruised too easily or quickly, because you never know, 10 years down the road, it might finally be the time for you and whoever that is to work together. And that can be great. Along with that, I'd also say, like, as I was saying, with a place like Storm King, someone could anticipate that, by seeing the other types of things we've done with younger artists, you can know, okay, it looks like they're making new work with people. And then you could kind of slip in, I've been interested in, this aspect of Northeast landscapes, or I was really interested in, an industrial environment turning back into something natural, or, you know, I think um, it can feel like a lot of pressure to be met with a like a really fleshed out proposal that you weren't expecting, but it can also feel like it opens up a conversation to hear kind of like a snippet of here's a point of intersection that might open up a conversation.
Max, for you, in the articles that you're writing, do you find that it's maybe for emerging mid-career artists easier to write something about a group show that has many artists around a theme that has it's kind of in the zeitgeist, for lack of a better word, as opposed to a solo artist or a solo show where it's harder to maybe I want to say justify like that person having a profile where a group show with like a broader theme and many artists might be easier to craft an article about?
Yeah, I mean, I think as important as solo shows are, which they are, especially within the gallery world, there's less and less coverage of that on Art News for sure, and in other publications in terms of, gallery solo shows being covered. That's just a reality of, Art News is a relatively small team. There are just so many things to cover that unfortunately we just don't have the resources really to cover gallery shows as rigorously as we once did. Um, and, I think, group shows can be really interesting in terms of, seeing a practice in a new light, and, seeing the juxtapositions between this artist and that artist. And it can get you thinking perhaps of even a third artist, like as kind of Nora mentioned, someone that you've tucked away in, the recesses of your, iPhone photo rolls, might be like, oh, maybe it's time to revisit this artist kind of thing. And I do think that's super important. I mean, when we just to kind of go back to like a point Nora made about, oh, if you've just had a solo show here, that means I can't do one here. The same also kind of works in journalism, unless it's a major show that everyone's going to cover. If one of our competitors has already done a pretty good piece on a given artist or on a, mostly a profile, I would say, especially of an emerging or mid-career artist, that's someone that we wouldn't necessarily cover right away. If we've written about you within the past 2 to 5 years, we probably won't write about you as a standalone piece again, just because even if your practice is moving very quickly and you're working in different bodies of work, usually it's too fast. There's so, as I mentioned, there's so many artists to cover, it's not, I guess, fair is the best way to say, to keep covering the same artists. I'd like to,
Shouldn't be that way. Yeah.
yeah, spread the coverage around, I guess, as it were. And just another point, it's never too late and it's never too early to start an archive. Starting your archives as an artist is so important. I know, especially for any of emerging artists who are, listening to this call, often when you are starting out, especially in, moments that feel very tumultuous, it can feel like, oh, you're just really in the practice. And I've heard that from a lot of, artists I've interviewed or profiles I've read that, a lot of the first 10 years of the practice are kind of a blur and there isn't great documentation of that. So I would just really, recommend that having a good website that kind of breaks out what bodies of works are what years is really helpful for the fact checking process. It makes my life as a journalist easier. I don't have to email you as I'm writing a piece to fact check when this body of work was started and if it's ongoing or if it ended. Having an updated CV is super important. And there was one other part to the question that you asked that now I'm blanking on.
That's okay. I'm also blanking.
No.
Hi, Musa. Welcome. Thanks for joining.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
You guys can hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi,
Okay.
welcome.
Thank you. No, sorry I hopped on a little bit late. Just
That's okay.
some
I understand.
emergency stuff came up with work.
Oh
So
boy. Jeez. I understand. We understand how it is. Max, one more question for you. How far in advance should people be reaching out to you for coverage? How much lead time does Art News typically need?
I would say it's like a delicate balance. I don't want to say like depending on my mood, but definitely if your show is opening next week and it's a 6 week show, it's almost impossible for me to cover that in term as a writer, and especially if it's a freelancer, as a editor, unless it's gonna come in the first week of the show. That's just, that timeline is too tight. We, you know, work our commissions for freelance pieces and for our writers in-house relatively far in advance. I would say like 2 to 3 months ahead of when the show is about to open is a good enough lead time. You don't want to reach out like a year in advance in case one, things change, or two, I just might forget that we had this conversation or something, about a show that sounds super interesting. But yeah, I would say maybe 2 to 3 months is a decent lead time for sure.
Okay. And Nora, for artists that you work with, what's a typical timeline like?
Okay. We often will know what we're doing 2, 3, 4 years out. Um, I hope. I mean, that's what I'm always going for, and there's so many reasons for that. Including what Max just said, which we're always looking at also, right, in terms of press coverage, but also thinking about strategic planning around a show, thinking about any public programs, thinking about fundraising, and foundation fundraising is usually about a 2 year lead time. So there are a lot of reasons why it's very beneficial to get things set. Um, One thing I would say is when you're invited to make a proposal somewhere, um, I think it's always good to get clarity on it can be, an awkward conversation all around. Get clarity on the time frame that that person needs you to work on, because they might kind of, feel a little awkward asking you for this too. They might say like, whatever you need. But like, actually, if you get it to them within 3 weeks, you might have more of a chance of kind of filling a hole in a calendar than if you really do take your time. So, why not always sort of know those deadlines? But yeah, we're scheduled really far out. The other thing about it is that, um, again, I can't stress enough how important I think it is to just give people the benefit of the doubt and the leeway that like something might happen later. And I have worked with artists after having conversations with them for 10 years. And it's not because, we were actually at that point of like, here's the project and let's wait, but more just like it wasn't the right moment. Also, remember, your work is not in a vacuum. There are a lot of other types of considerations that an institution would have. Maybe that's, a balance of voices from around the world, or if they're an institution that is, I mean, whatever their time frame is, you might want more historical figures balanced with something more contemporary. You might want, something that's more performance based balanced with, something more static. Whatever it is. Another thing to what Max was saying is I also think if you are a performing artist, it is so hard to only see stills. um give what you can. If you're a media based artist, what do you want us to see first of that clip? Maybe start not at the beginning if you're looking for somebody's attention within the first. I think the rule of, I mean, I know this from our press team, but I think the rule of social media is like you want to keep something under a minute. So what's in that first minute that you want people to know?
I was,
And
Go ahead, Max.
I'll just add, I remember the point about kind of the timing. Um, Something we always ask, especially our freelancers, is kind of why now? Why should we cover this artist or this exhibition or this story now? And oftentimes, if we can't answer that question right now, but we do like the artist, we will be like, okay, let's like see if they have anything else coming up, if there's a better peg that, especially if we're over commission budget wise, that's later in the year where we can tell that story. So it is sometimes, if we do believe in practice and want to cover it, it might just have to happen at a later date for a lot of other factors.
Right. Musa, for you, as an art advisor, and you're also on the board at the Queen's Museum, how do artists get on your radar to recommend to clients, to collectors? What is the way that you most become aware of new and emerging artists? Oh, you're muted again, sorry.
Usually, when it comes to emerging artists, I'm kind of the one that's like looking for them, not them looking for me. I think that's what makes what I do every day when I wake up so invigorating is that the thought of discovery is super important to my practice of what I do. When it comes to emerging, with established and blue chip artists, a whole nother kind of way to go about it. But strictly with emerging artists, I'm usually going to them, or I'm usually having conversation with their peers. Like a lot of times where I learn or discover artists is through other artists too as well, which I think speaks volumes to when you are emerging artists to build community. I think community is super important. I tell artists all the time, most artists that are successful is because they build community around their practice and their career. Because not only they are helping themselves, but they helping their other peers around them too as well, right? So those are kind of like the fundamental parts, but then the gradual kind of building relationship is important too, right? So not even just the transaction part, but just like knowing who the artist is important, the day to day, because I think that resonates with I think the common goal of where this particular artist should land in the collection, right? Because I think from what our last conversation, I'll tell you that each collection, has a different story and it has a different dialogue, right? So you want to make sure when you're an artist, not only that you are someone that's built a community, but then I think another important role is that you go to where you think that your art matters, right? In this art world, there's many different sectors to be in, right? And as you become an artist, and you look at your practice, you just have to have a real conversation with yourself. Where do I see myself at in the next 3 to 4 years? Do I see myself working with a Nora with Storms King or with the Lackmo or whoever the case is, right? You got to ask yourself those type of questions. And how you are able to lead that conversation is the peers around you, because most likely they are in spaces that you're not in, so they can inform you more too as well. So, for me, it's really just a genuine conversation that I have with artists that I think leads to the transaction part, not just going straight to the transaction. That's actually the last thing that I think about or that I do.
Do you find new artists on Instagram, group shows, open studios? What are some of the places that you go to look and make those discoveries?
It's a really great question. Instagram is really great, but with Instagram, you can't really, see the details of art. So I like to actually go directly to the artist studios. If an artist is in school, I try to go to do studio visits in their school, or if they have a thesis show that they have, I try to go directly to them. Or if it's something where I hear if it's their first time showing in a gallery, I always like the excitement of an artist showing for the first time in a gallery because it just gives you that perspective of how they are thinking of themselves outside of the studio. I think they spend so much time in the studio, you could tell that they get wrapped into their practice where when it goes to a gallery, it's a whole nother dimension for them too. So like me seeing it for the first time in the gallery, I can kind of see how they pivot from the studio space to the gallery space. And if artists ask me for, any suggestions or ideas or recommendations, I always give them that feedback too, either during or after the show, because a lot of times I would want to see what someone like a Max is writing about their show, so could see if I'm thinking the same thing he's thinking, or it may be something that I missed, right? Where I'm looking at the show, but then Max wrote something about it where it's like, oh wow, I didn't see it in that dimension too. So, it's really great because even though we are all in these different spaces, we are all connected in some type of way, to the artists and their career.
I totally understand about Instagram. I think artists feel like they should be posting all of their work and every on Instagram all the time, and that's a great way to be seen, but it is so hard to really understand a work in that small little box. Uh, excuse me. What strategies do you think an artist can be using to like increase their visibility and be seen and be in places where you're going to discover them in group shows or open studios?
Yeah, I mean, I know artists hate to go to fairs, so that's the last thing I ever tell them to do is to do that.
It's so expensive.
But I usually try to tell them to whatever city they in, or if they are traveling, to look to see what's in those cities and don't be afraid to engage in it, right? If it's an artist that you always admire, right? Go to that artist's show because you never know what comes about it. I know artists, plenty of conversations where artists like went to a prestigious artist opening and they wound up becoming like their studio assistant and helping them out, right? And even with that connection, because of that artist having a big name, they helping that artist out, right? I know Max is talking about CVs, that's a great thing to put on your CV that you are affiliated with a particular artist, especially like a prestigious artist, right? Because you're kind of along for the ride for them, right? And they just teaching you just so many things about the studio, about how to conduct yourself as an artist, and all these other, pillars that go into it. I know Nora can speak more into that too as well, but it's definitely a throughway into that. So that's just one out of many ways to do it. When you're an artist, the world is open to you. There's many ways that people can discover you and have yourself be immersed in the space.
I think also just even, this group here, like, Musa, as you're talking, I'm remembering like we met for the, as we discovered on the kind of preview that we did in the Zoom, we had met very briefly at a dinner, an artist dinner 3 years ago. And I think it's totally right. Like just going to things that you're interested in and seeing who else is there and going to the next thing. I mean, even I live in New York City, and even here, it's like you do see people again, and I think probably in other cities there are ways in which that's even easier. And also thinking about Instagram, I think actually a way that people have successfully used Instagram, successfully, whatever that means, right? But like that I've engaged with artists on Instagram also has to do with if you meet them at an event and then they follow up
Mhm.
um, about a conversation you had, that can be really helpful. Or there have actually been a few artists who have commented on things that, I've written just in ways that were like we actually then got to know each other. So I think there are other things about Instagram besides just posting work that can be more or less effective, but other ways that, some people are good at using it.
I think too that the idea of not just posting maybe your own work, but like you're saying, Nora, to be sharing other artists' work, to be engaging in a conversation about art on your Instagram profile or whatever social media you're using, kind of is using that as a connective tissue to find other artists that like you or museums, galleries, advisors, and just sort of make those connections. If you share somebody's work and then they come and check out your profile and follow you, they may share your work at a later date. And then maybe Musa sees it that way, or, there's just so many different ways to get on people's radar. Musa, Nora was talking a little bit ago about studio visits and what makes a successful studio visit. When you go to see a studio and meet with an artist, what are some of the things that help that be successful?
Yeah, to me, I like to go in it really unhinged. Like if the artist has unfinished work, please leave it there. If it's paint all over the floor, please leave it there because I want to see how you're thinking as you process. And obviously, there should be some type of flow that they have produced for the studio visit, right? So they should be able to learn how to talk about their work, whether it's finished or unfinished. Talk to the person about the process. So I love the rule of engagement when it comes to talking, where artists talk about their work. I think that's super important. But I think also when an artist is in their studio and they open to ideas and suggestion, I always like to give it, even though I try not to, because I don't want to have no type of influence into the work, but if an artist asks me, hey, what do you think I should do with this? Or how do you think I should, do this process? I probably will tell them, hey, from past other successful artists that I've seen maybe have worked in the same medium as them, I kind of give them a little leeway and give them kind of discoveries as far as like references that they can research themselves. But really just a genuine conversation. It's not really, I feel like when an artist is in their studio, it shouldn't be no pressure. That's where they actually have the least amount of pressure, right? Because I tell them that's where your practice, right? If you are not a good speaker or can't really talk to people, try it through me, right? When I go through the gallery or when I go through the studio visit, if you're afraid of asking something, me being there, you should ask me that because then I can tell you, hey, maybe you might not want to, ask that type of question about your work, or maybe, you should think about it in this type of way, because then when an artist do have their first show, right, going back to like the artist's first show, they know how to engage more proper into it. So just really just kind of those engagement when I go into an artist studio, because artists, most of the time when it's an emergent artist, it's like their living space. So like they live there and they practice there. So that's always interesting because they try to set up, hey, this is where I live and work. I'm like, don't feel embarrassed. That's actually very common. Don't feel like it's something that you should be embarrassed about. So I try to make artists feel as comfortable as they can be when I'm in the studio, and vice versa. I want them to be comfortable with me when I'm in their studio too, when I do studio visits.
Is it helpful for them to have like their artist statement, CV, things printed out for you to take with you? Or is that
I
something they
mean,
email when they follow up with you? Or
yeah, no, great question. I mean, if it's a new artist, they don't even have a CD, right? It's like they just coming out of school. So like a lot of times they don't even have a CV. But again, just a genuine uh conversation behind the work, right? I don't think you need a CV because by that point, Max, me, Nora, we already kind of looked at their CV, so you actually don't need that, right? I do suggest that if you are working on or have a finished body work, I always try to recommend having a finished body work because sometimes if you're looking at it through Instagram, you don't know how it looks in person. So you want that finished kind of subject matter. But that's really about it.
Max, you were going to chime in something about studio visits, maybe?
I was, but I again lost. I will say, as Musa said, I also approach a studio visit or an interview as a conversation. Like I do often come with questions. Sometimes I don't. It really depends on the artist, and kind of how much I know about their practice, how extensive it is. But I think, how I approach them is through, just trying to understand the practice more. It's not, I think there can be a tendency to fear that journalists might, be there with like gotcha questions or, trying to misquote you. That definitely, I'm sure, happens. It's not how I approach my practice as a writer and as a journalist. I try to write and report very accurately and responsibly and coming from a place of understanding. I see myself as, trying to tell your story in the way that I know how to, that'll reach a broader audience because when I've committed to a story, there is, an investment on my end too, because I believe in the work in the way that a curator does, in the way that a collector and advisor does, in the way that a gallery or museum does. So yeah, just and if you have a bad studio visit experience that's not coming from a place of understanding, just like please don't take that as like that's how all of them are going to be. I guess was my point.
Can I one thing just also about I'm a visiting critic at Columbia and I do a lot of other visits with MFA programs. Also maybe good for you to know what I have seen is that as a student in one of these programs, you can go to the administrator and say, I was wondering if these three people could come and visit this year. And they often will go and reach out to those people. So, like, that's nice too. It's kind of an unusual moment for you to be able to kind of have these kind of tentacles out there that aren't only from you, especially that early in your career. One thing that, a few people have done, like, so when you go into these schools, obviously, excuse me, not obviously, that's not what I meant. Oftentimes, they're not giving like the nicest, most beautiful building to the art students, right? Like, we're not in economics here, we're not scientists, right? Sorry about that. But so what it can mean is that it can be a bit of a confusing experience. And I've had a lot of just like, oh my God, how do I get this door unlocked? Like right from the start. And sometimes people have just anticipated these types of things. Like a few students at these types of studio visits, Columbia or elsewhere, have kind of waited for me outside the door, right? And they're there because they're the first person on my list of 8. And they're like, hey, I'm here because this sure was confusing when I started here, and let me bring you up. It goes a long way. And then also with that, I think it's always really nice when someone keeps the time frame in mind that's been given. I really, you're often in a place where you're seeing 8 artists in a row. And that is, again, that is wonderful. That is a privilege. It's also a lot of kind of thinking time. And it can be really nice if someone else is not thinking, oh, wow, they're still here and we're still talking. I'll just take an extra 10 minutes because everything else, and you often get home at like 11 or 12 from, not 12, okay, but like you'll get home at 11 from these things. And it's nice to just kind of like have people sort of understand what that feels like and help you by kind of staying within the parameters and thinking, getting right into the conversation right away. I've also, and this is, I don't think this is people who would be as thoughtful as our whole group, but I've had some people, I've gone to some studios that there have been cups, knocked over from the party they had the night before. There are still limes out and cut up, and it's like, no, like, and their friend had to call 20 minutes, into the 40 minutes, and I'm not giving you another 40 minutes. Like, we're all here as adults.
Yeah, professionalism goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Musa, for many emerging artists, the dream is that a collector is going to discover them and to become their patron and help support them and nurture them and help them grow and buy their work or help pay for residencies or things like that. How often does that happen, and how does that happen? How can an artist have that relationship start?
It's extremely common, I would say. Majority artists, they are discovered through collectors and through advisors and through curators before galleries. So I think in the beginning, that's the most fundamental support that they need in the very beginning of their career. I think when it comes to collectors supporting artists, what I've kind of witnessed over the years is that if a collector is supporting a particular artist and they have more, usually it's more than 1 or 2 works that they have, they are also supporting them in other ways than just buying their works. If an artist's career, they have their first museum show, and I think Nora told you, that it takes 2 years to put a show together. The collector already knows about the show 2 years prior because she's going to the artist support system, which is the collector, right? And getting those funds or getting some type of support sponsorship around them, right? So a collector is helping an artist fundamentally in multiple ways throughout their career. Now, how can that last? I think it goes back to what we all talking about is growing a foundation in a relationship, right? I think if a collector has a real relationship with an artist, they are not thinking about it as a tangible relationship where it's just, hey, I'm paying for this, I'm paying for that. They are with them and having gradual conversation with them, So what I would tell an artist meeting a collector for the first time, don't just talk about your practice, talk about your life, talk about, how you got to choose what school you got to. Talk to them about, what apartment you're looking for, right? Like collectors are human beings just like they're human beings, right? And they want that connectivity and that connection, right? And I think when I see artists have that relationship with collectors, I think those are the relationships that last throughout their whole career, throughout a lifetime, right? And also what happens is that those collectors are connected with that artist where there's people that's outside the art world that know that that person's connected with them, right? So if someone is, is having a show and they need a work loan, for that show, like they'll go to that collector before they even go to the artist because that collector been showing that artwork, for the past 5 years in different shows and loaning it out. Or, Max might have seen it in the show and seen the provenance and seen that, X, Y, and Z, and then want to have more conversation around the story. And they'll probably go down a deep dive with Max. Hey, it's not just about the artwork, it's about the story of me learning about the artist, right? So when we talk about provenance, those relationships are part of your provenance, it's part of your CV, and it's part of something that's going to carry yourself throughout your whole career. So I think just a genuine relationship with a collector always lasts the longest.
Where can, is there a match.com for artists and collectors? How can artists find the person that might be interested in being their supporter?
Match.com, right? I mean, you might have thought of something just now tonight. You have to put something like that together, right?
I'm going to be a millionaire now.
Yeah, no. I think what's the good part about the world we live in right now is that we're connected in so many ways, right? And I think publication is a really big connection to that. I think a lot of these publications are coming out with these 200, 300, 400 list of collectors. And I would just tell artists, look for where those collectors are at, right? Because if you read those publications, it's kind of right there in the blueprint where those collectors look at works, right? You have some collectors that say, hey, I like to travel to Brazil and discover artists there. I like to go to Mexico City or I like to go to LA, right? And if you are in those cities, just pop up to where those people are at, right? So I think, looking at a firm list of collectors, especially if you want to be connected with the collectors that actually have push in the world in the art world, right? Because a lot of times it might not be the gallery art, the first show that they have as the big, root, like the big momentum for their career. It actually might have been just because, this collector owned it and that collection is a prestigious collection and, people will follow that, right? So there's many ways you will, I would say, find collectors. And I think going to just a show is the obvious because collectors do go to show. I know people think that collectors are only on their Instagram and looking at artists, but collectors still like to go to shows and just like how we like to discover, they also like to discover too as well, So, and a lot of times I'm bringing my clients to the show, right? Especially if it's a artist that I think that will resonate with their collection, I bring them a lot of times to those shows too as well. So a lot of times when an artist see me with someone, majority of the time they're like, oh, that's Musa, he's an advisor. If he's with that person, that's a collector, right? So they'll put two and two together. And I think that just goes on to what we're all talking about is that the more galleries or the more shows you go to, the more you kind of know how the ecosystem work, where you know that this person's a curator. Oh, I might want to speak to this person because I seen that, I follow them on Instagram, right? Or, I know this person's a dealer. I might not be at their gallery space, but I'm having a matcha and they sitting right next to me. Let me just have a conversation with them, right? A lot of times that's how shows are created. One of the first shows I curated was during COVID. And it was in Chelsea. And at the time, everything was closed down, right? Like no galleries was open, not even the streets was open, right? But I had the show in June of 2020, where I was trying to find a way where I could support the artists because collectors wasn't necessarily buying works, right? But I still wanted to support these artists. So with my own money out of my pocket, I put the show together and out that show, I showed maybe 15 to 20 artists. And at the end of that show, three artists got represented by galleries on that same block, you know? So again, just kind of like putting themselves out there because a lot of the artists was their first time even showing in the show. Jeffrey Maris, who went to Yale, he wasn't even showing at a show yet. And I was like, hey, I learned your artist through this other artist friend of mine, Derek, Dominic Chambers, where he just like, hey, it's this kid where he's, I feel like he's going to be the next David Hemmings. He just was telling me so much about him. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do a studio visit with him. And I met Jeffrey and I was like, hey, let me, like, you want to show this show? He's like, I only got this one work, Musa. I'm like, this is all you need, man. This is your this is your presentation to the world, to the art world. So, let that be known. And ironically, that work just got placed into the Studio Museum, right? So again, just that conversation of how the transition from the artist, from their school all the way to their first show, it could be in many conversations that they are discovered through either a collector, through a gallery, through a curator, through a writer.
I also think there's something to that that's even just thinking about those relationships and everything. It everything is, nothing's in a vacuum, right? No artist is working on an island by themselves somewhere, etc. And it can be, I mean, I think another thing to do just in a consistent way is pay attention to what's going on around you and, know who you might be referenced, kind of in collaboration with, right? Like you know that your work looks like that surrealist that somebody might, cite you with because I think that's important also, like that understanding of what you're doing based on kind of the larger world of arts and history of arts around you, I think can also just make for a richer conversation with people and kind of not leave people hanging in terms of like, did they mean that? Or was that sort of maybe maybe me thinking that was not right on because they don't seem to understand what I was mentioning or not understand, but know what I was mentioning. So I think it's really to your benefit to also just pay attention.
Max and Nora, do you have anything to say about collectors and artists and any relationships you've known of between an artist and collector and how that started or how that evolved and what that a positive success story of a collector and artist working together?
I can't think of like a example, but I do know a lot of collectors just managing the top 200 collectors list for last 12 editions, I think. Um, and so I will say to Musa's point, a lot of contemporary art collectors, not all, but a lot do like, you know, to engage with the artists that they collect. They do want to, not just know about the work, but know about them on a human level. That's definitely the truth. And you'll see like a lot of people, a lot of artists and collectors have really deep friendships that have just, come from that. And, you know, for better or for worse, I guess, the art world is a very just social, you know, place. There is, a lot of networking and, I go through my moments where it's like, okay, I don't really want to go to all the openings. I'd rather just, see art. By myself, like on a Tuesday, in Chelsea at like 2 p.m. And not be bothered with that. But yeah, I mean, to Nora's point, just, seeing a lot of art and reading a lot about what, people are saying, I think is always an important thing to just be aware about what's happening around you, because you aren't creating in a vacuum. Similar artists might be, making similar work, and that could be an opportunity for you to reach out to them and be like, hey, I really like your work. And as, Musa said, they might start connecting you with other artists. Like you'd be surprised by how often you know, curators, dealers, critics learn about artists through other artists. And to Musa's earlier point, you'd be surprised by how many artists have been studio assistants for really important artists. It will kind of blow your mind once you start, especially if you become a studio assistant, if you aren't already, like kind of the artistic lineage of people who have passed through different studios. Um,
Um,
I I would say just about that collector question also, I think what Musa was saying was totally right. And I've actually had the experience of some collectors are also people we work with closely in many ways at Storm King. I've had the experience that might not be expected of many collectors sort of feeling like, oh, well, I couldn't bother that artist for a visit, or oh no, I need to, to keep my distance. They're not going to be interested in meeting with me. And it does seem like an opportunity, even if it seems a little scary, giving somebody an invitation is such a nice thing to do. It might not come back, but you might find, especially if you've just entered somebody's collection, it's just nice. They might say no, but it's just nice. And I think you should always feel, like that type of invitation for a conversation is, even if it's rejected, kind.
Max, if an artist is looking through the top 200 collectors list and finds a couple that they think might be interested in their work, what would you suggest is the best way for an artist to kind of cold call, reach out to that collector and say, I think I'm making stuff that you want to see?
That I don't really have an answer for. I'm not an advisor, so it is not my job to, connect artists and curators, I mean, artists and collectors together. So I wouldn't say I would know how they best to do it other than, I guess reaching out to them on Instagram might honestly be the easiest way since I doubt a lot of their emails are, circulating online. But I mean, as Musa said, you'd be surprised how many collectors go to fairs and openings and just they might know someone that you know and you can start engaging in a conversation. And I think again, that's why it is really important to have even some form of photography of your practice that you can show them, in the moment, like, oh, this is what, I just completed, or this is, you know, depending, every artist is different depending on how their comfort level of showing, kind of works in progress that are unfinished, but oh, this is what I'm working on or something. But just having, documentation of your work is always just so key. You'd be surprised how many emails I get, which I do not respond to, that do not include images of the artwork that is going to be on view or that they are discussing. And it's, really hard for me to evaluate anything when there's no images attached to your press release or your email.
Musa, what would you say if an artist finds a collector on a list? How do they reach out to them directly? Do they send them a DM on Instagram and say, "You want to come look at my work," or what should they do?
It's interesting you said that. I've so for the past 3 years, 3 to 4 years, I've worked with 4 clients that just got on that list. And before that, they was, pretty much under the radar, right? I had a client that's in Atlanta, and then I have another client that's in Chicago, and they've pretty much under the radar. And the moment that they got on that, the 200 list, they don't have an email, but those artists found a way to reach them. They found a way to reach them, right? So I think on that part, I think artists already know how to kind of do the reach out. But I think the most important part, I would say, is when you reach out to a collector, know what you're preparing to have a conversation about. I think that's super important because remember, this collector is getting pulled left and right throughout the day, right? For me as an advisor, I'm kind of narrowing that down for them, right? Instead of them having 500 previews, I'm narrowing it down where it's like, hey, this is the 10 and 3 that you should see that I think resonates with the conversation and the dialogue in your collection, right? And as I think that way, I think artists also think that way when it comes to introducing themselves to a collector, especially if it's their first time, right? You should know how you want to present that conversation. I think what Max said is super important. Like if you have some type of like photography or some type of image of your work when you're having that conversation. Because I mean, the first thing a collector is going to say when they're having a conversation with you is like, "Oh, let me see this work, right? Let me see what you're talking about, right?" So if you have like a video of you, you're practicing your studio while you're doing it, that might intrigue them to do their first studio visit with you, right? It's like, "Oh, wow, okay. Oh, wait, actually, I know the studio that you're in because that building, I visit another studio, another artist, in that studio. Like, I'd love to come by, right?" So I think really just knowing what you want to have what conversation you want to have with the collector once you meet them, I think is probably the most important because that's going to bring them to see you again or have that initial conversation after, right? Um, and I think also what's super important, and I know again, artists hate to like be in public spaces and things like that, but um be interested in showing, be no, be interested in having your work in public spaces. Um I think that that's not a conversation a lot of artists, especially traditional artists, think about because they just think about them being in the studio and from the studios to the gallery or to a museum. But public spaces is super important. I seen what it did for a lot of artist careers throughout their career where they might have been under the radar, where they was just a traditional institutional artist, and them having their first public viewing, it kind of expanded their career like tenfold, right? Because you don't know who's looking at that work when it's in the public space, right? Um, so going to the conversation of how you want your work to be presented when it comes to like public spaces and public artwork, you should want to know how your work is presented in conversation with it.
This is a question for all three of you or any one of you. Do you think can you rank the importance of an artist participating in different kinds of opportunities, nonprofit group shows, open call shows, self-produced shows, art fairs, residencies, acting as a curator for shows of other people's work, getting grant funding? Like what are of those things when you see an artist has participated in an opportunity is making the most impact for you? Are there certain things you're looking for?
Um, I would say, art fairs are probably going to give you some of the most visibility you'll have in your, career, especially early on. I wouldn't necessarily rank that higher. I mean, I think, as a writer and, when I look at a CV, having a residency, if that's something that's possible for you, it's not possible for everyone. I think does, it is kind of just like a stamp of imprimatur on kind of you as an artist, unfortunately. And I think, or not unfortunately, but we still work that way in many respects. Um, so I mean, I think, if you're able to do residencies, you should apply for them. Um, open call exhibitions, I think can be really great. And I mean, I think all opportunities are great. And if you have the bandwidth to try to do it and the production, you can. But I will say, art fairs, you probably are going to get more visibility there than you might at any of the other options you list.
I was just going to agree and say, I think it's hard to say one or the other when everything is hard to get, right? And you should apply to the things that you have the bandwidth to apply for and see where you end up.
Nora, keyword bandwidth is super important because as
Bandwidth.
you know, there's different levels to all the things we're talking about. There's different levels to fairs. So like if you're an emerging artist, you shouldn't be trying to get in Art Basel or get into Freeze Art Fair. You have these lower ranked fairs where people also still go see, right? People go to those fairs and they really look at, and it's cost efficient. You got to think about when a gallery, because when a gallery is participating in your practice, they think about all these things, right? It's like, okay, your work is X, Y, and Z. This booth is this much. Would I make the money back and be able to support your career? Galleries think about those things. So if you're aiming for a high-end gallery where they showing works that's $100,000 and over, and you're a brand new artist, you shouldn't be looking at those galleries. You should be working with the lower rank galleries because one, you're coming up together with the gallery, right? As the gallery, career goes, your career also goes too. I think that's a conversation that, that always happens too, where you see that. I mean, a good example is Kordansky, right? When Rashid's career was going up, David's career was going up as a gallerist at the same time, right? So that conversation always should apply to how they think about where they're participating in.
What are some of your favorite fairs to go to find emerging artists?
Um, Great question. There's so many fairs. I mean, as you just asked that, I just had 100 that just popped up in my head. Uh, I think it depends on what city you're in. When I'm in Miami, I try to go to Nada, try to go to Untitled. I try not to go to Scope, but I somehow find my way in Scope sometimes too as well. If I'm in New York, um, again, Nada also shows in New York too as well. They have Untitled. That's a really, really great fair. They also have Independent, and Independent is probably one of my favorite fairs to go and engage and look at um, undiscovered artists. But those are probably some of them. I know Nora and Max probably have a few favorite too as well.
Yeah, same question to you and Nora and Max, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the ones Musa mentioned are definitely, the satellite fairs that I go to. You know, Most of these are, incumbent on kind of gallery representation. So if you don't have that, that can definitely be a barrier. But there is one fair that I think is super cool. I mean, well, two in Mexico City. One's Material, which is, more of the traditional fair. But Salon Acme actually also has, it might just be for the open call portion, might just be for, Mexican or Latin American based artists, but it has a open call for a fair. It's in this like Porfirio Diaz era kind of dilapidated, I don't know, townhouse estate building from that era. And it's just a really cool fair. And I've seen a lot of artists there that I probably would not see anywhere else, in the world. And a portion of them, got into it via an open call. And it's still like a very respectable fair as opposed to some of like the other satellite fairs that I have not mentioned. But yeah.
Nora,
Uh,
what about you?
I I would say, I see things at fairs, but I don't know that that's kind of my primary way of working with someone next. I think also for me, fairs end up being such a kind of like social thing that it's a little like wherever I am in that week, like probably get through two and then I crash. So I do my best. I do really like independent. I've always enjoyed it and I like the way it was founded and yeah, so it's one that sticks out for me.
Musa and Nora, what advice would you give an artist on navigating their first sale or private commission? How do artists set their prices? I think that's a question a lot of artists have, like what they don't want to price their work too high, but they don't want to price their work too low and then not be taken seriously. How should they navigate that
I
situation?
have no insights on that.
Yeah, there is a like a unlike regulated rule of price setting, right? I think yeah, it's definitely that's definitely something. When it comes to pricing works, especially if you're just now coming out of school, I probably genuinely tell artists not to price their works over 10,000 just because I think they should keep in mind the first engagement of collectors that they're going to be engaging in is not these multi-millionaire, billionaire collectors, right? It's collectors that work 9 to 5 and they have a passion for it and they might not be able to afford, a work that's 20, $30,000, right? So you want as many people to own your work in the beginning as possible. Because I think that helps your practice too, right? When that happens. So I usually generally say anything, lower than 10 to 12K is where you want to start at, depending on medium, obviously, right? Because we also got to think about cost efficient and, how much they are actually spending to produce a work. So within that price range, depending on the medium is where I probably tell them either higher or lower within that 10 to 12, I would say.
Um, I assume scale, like you mentioned material, obviously scale, prior sales, all those kinds of factors kind of go into what makes a price feel justified or accurate for a work.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously galleries do it in a whole different kind of perspective because they are working with usually when they are working with an artist, they're not just doing like a one-off. They are thinking about working with that artist throughout the year. So they are also educating the artists on one, how many works that they should be able to produce to be in these art fairs and be in these group shows and solo shows. So they have that relationship with the gallery. And I think based on how that leads. Obviously, when it comes to, I think prices for artists, they just don't jump up like right away, right? It's some type of rule and engagement where throughout the years, right, as more galleries, I mean, more collectors own their work, more institutions own their work, more corporate, because there's, a big conversation of corporate collections, right? More corporate collections on their work. I think that's when you see those prices, jump. And I know COVID was this time where, everybody was happy and buying all these amounts of works, but obviously that was just a small period of time where that happened, where we seen that happen in the art world and more specifically in the secondary market. But now we're at this place where we're kind of resetting. And I think when artists think about a reset, they should think about, you know, if you pricing the work for your art, you don't want to overprice because you can never go back down. I tell artists that all the time. Like once you price yourself where that's at, you got to stick by that, right? So,
Mhm.
um, when an artist is thinking about working with a gallery, because sometimes gallery like to compare artists in their program, I tell them don't have that sense of like urgent that you have to compare yourself to artists that's in the gallery program. You should really just focus on your career because 9 times out of 10, that artist might not be working with that gallery 5, 6 years from now, right? So.
Max, does having a sale or how does that affect, a journalist's idea of whether or not they want to cover an artist? If let's say there's an emerging artist, but they've never sold anything, but you love their work, is it's having a sale going to make a difference?
No, I don't think that's a calculus that comes into definitely not mine or any of my colleagues. I mean, I will say if, certain collectors are looking at an artist, that does go a long way, but no, not having sold anything, I would say isn't. But I mean, we do look at, kind of other barometers like what group shows have they been in? Have they been in any kind of museum shows? If they are represented by a gallery or, at least have shown at at a, respectable gallery on any kind of level and scale, whether it's the ones that work with specifically just emerging artists or emerging mid-career, all the different tiers that they're at. But yeah, I don't think, I mean, artists living off their art is super important, but don't think that should be, kind of the primary concern. But I understand that it is really a difficult reality when you don't have gallery representation and you don't have a, studio manager or something, and it is kind of, you doing it all on your own. It's definitely, kind of, the art of the possible in many ways as to what you feel that you can accomplish while still carving out the time to do your art, which I think, is, what should be driving you forward.
Question for all of you. What what do you think about artsy and online galleries versus brick and mortar? How important are platforms like Artsy becoming to the art industry? And will smaller galleries ever kind of go away and just be online and it'll end up being more of a larger blue chip gallery situation?
Yeah, I think brick and mortar will never go away because you always have to see the work, right? And that's the only way you're able to see the work when you have that right foundation. I think what makes an artsy or online auctions visible for people is the collectors that might not be able to be accessible to those artists, right? So you think about artists that live in America, I think that when you have those platforms, collectors in Asia are more accessible to the work, right? Or people in South America is more accessible to work. So I think when it comes to online, it just gives a broader connection to artists to be able to sell their work to collectors that might not be able to have access to these art fairs that we are always getting, thrown at, right? I mean, we probably seen 100 fairs a year, right? But there's some collectors that they don't go to fairs at all. They don't participate in that, right? So that just is just a way for them to participate. I remember when I first started working at Sotheby's, they only had either in person or phone bids, right? And it wasn't this online factor, right? And when COVID happened, they kind of had to reimagine how the auction houses are, right? When they are able to engage in online. And now majority of sales are online, right? Because people are not going to an auction house and buying their works, right? It's the same thing for a gallery, right? I mean, you have a brick and mortar that might be in Chelsea, but if you are associated with artsy, a person that never seen your gallery can buy an artist right then and there without even, stepping foot into a gallery. I think the only thing that I've seen that always happen, right, is when a gallery enhance their PDF or do some type of editing to work. When a collector always get it, it always look always different. So I will always say when it comes to galleries or when it comes to artists showing their work online, just make sure you want to keep that image as real as possible because that helps with the process of when a collector is collecting your work, knowing that what they're seeing is what they're getting.
Right. Yeah, Max, do you ever cover like artsy only exhibitions or?
No, I haven't. That which is not to say that that's not something to do, but yeah, I mean I don't think brick and mortar are going away. I think like something that which, the economics of the world being what they are, take this with a grain of salt. Something I do think that's, missing in the art world in many ways, though seems to be coming back is, just a lot of, artist organized exhibitions where, they're just putting it on themselves in kind of a random space and, just working together to get the word out and, via word of mouth and stuff like that. And I think, that's also, a great way to get people to see the work in person, which again, I think everyone can agree is, the best way to experience art unless it's, made for a screen in a, digital first way.
Um,
I don't have so many insights on artsy except it is I do feel like a lot of these platforms have a lot of really smart people working there, and I know a number of them, and I do think they do try to kind of find ways to sort of optimize the experience of finding something on that platform for people. And I think there's a wide variety of things on there and a lot of people looking at it. We use it for sometimes we use it for charity auctions that we do, and that's kind of been the extent of my engagement.
do any of you have any like anecdotes or real world success stories about emerging artists and how they broke through in this industry and kind of took their career to the next level and what happened for them?
Mm.
The
I
tough
mean,
one.
I think, um, I did a studio visit, at an MFA program with an artist and saw a number of films that she'd made. But from kind of the themes of the films, was able to think, I can understand this person working outside and being outside. And then those conversations really led in a great direction. And we did end up working together from that. So that felt really nice and kind of like a good reason to talk about yourself, right? Again, in all these ways that we've talked about, but also just like, what are your interests in broad picture ways that can translate from medium to medium and aren't just specific to this little thing? Not little, specific thing.
Um, Two rapid fire questions. Is it ever worthwhile to pay for a review or press coverage?
So I will just say that ArtNews does not, I mean, we don't do pay for play at all. There is, a sponsored content aspect to it that is very clearly marked, but it's not written by any of our, reporters or anything. So, we don't accept payment for reviews in that kind of transactional way. I think I really could not name publications that do accept it in that way. So, I would recommend very strongly advise against it. I don't see necessarily to what extent it would necessarily help your career in terms of getting additional press coverage if that's what you're looking for.
No? Nora, Musa, anything?
I have
No.
no
I
idea.
was gonna see how if I mean if Max was gonna say yes, I was gonna see how much I had to give him because I already but no, usually, I mean, one of the things I did recently, I had a client who, he's a collector and, he built a foundation, around his philanthropy. He's an athlete, but he's also is a collector and he's trying to merge, them two together. And, I think what resonates with someone like a Max, maybe going and getting your story is the art of storytelling. So I think just having a real genuine story about your collection or about your practice is super important. Because I think the less that someone like Max have to pull, the better or easier it is for him. I think when you just give maybe like a brief, summary of like your work and give it to someone like Max, if it's not all there, he's probably not going to want to go a deep dive and have to do all this research. So the more information you can give someone like him, I think the better for an artist, right? I think it does go back obviously to the CV, but then even with a CV, right? Like you want to highlight the best things on that CV, right? You don't want to give, someone a whole rundown 5 page long CV, right? Of these group shows that you went in, right? I mean, having a CV really curated, I think is super important. And then I would also say the last thing I would say is that you should be going, I think Max talked about it too a little bit, but I'm probably gonna go a little bit deeper into it, is that if you know that you're gonna have a show within a year, you should already start the conversation with these publications so they can be familiar with the show coming up, right? Again, speaking to what Max said, you don't want to give an art, you don't want to give a publication, your letter, or PR press release paper, a week ahead of the show or 2 weeks ahead of the show. You want them to be engaged into it. A lot of my collectors, they again loan and donate work. So because they are a part of, a lot of institutional shows, um, they also will help the engagement of publications too as well, get write-ups and things like that for museum shows, more particularly than galleries, because galleries have their own PR team that they send out their press release for the shows.
Okay, well, we're almost at 7:45, so let's turn to Julianne and see what questions might have come in the Q&A.
So a lot of the references you guys have given for success stories or ways you found artists have gone through very standard conventional, like institutional support type of means. Do you have any where you look for artists other than Instagram, as many people are starting to give up Instagram for moral reasons? Are there any other ways, any other places that you search for artists or ways you come across work?
I think artist, through another artist for sure. Um, and in person in various ways.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I would say I mostly do, unfortunately, learn about stuff through institutional or gallery stuff and, just getting emails about it, as opposed to, I don't think there's some secret outside kind of alternative that none of us have said because I don't think that exists, unfortunately. It's not something that I've experienced. It can be very conventional still to this day.
There's no secret clubhouse, unfortunately, that everyone's meeting in to choose who's the next great artist.
Yeah.
So you say show up a lot for a way to
I
do
think you
that.
should
So
show up.
most artists, I would say, have to work a day job, majority full time, and are making their work on the side. Do you have any recommendation for how to balance all of that as an artist?
I mean, I really think that's up to, the artist. I think you should be trying to see art, do your practice, and I understand that, life is, gets in the way of that at times, work can get in the way of that. But as Nora said earlier in the conversation, it is a long, journey. And I don't think, you should give up just because you haven't found success right away. I think, there is kind of this mentality in the art world from maybe the past 10, 15 years that emerging artists need to find overnight success and be the next hot thing and be a market darling and get all these auction prices. And, unfortunately, what happens is a lot of those careers, because they happen so quickly, are not sustainable. And so I think you really do need to think about how you can sustain a practice over decades. If you are committed to being an artist in that way, it is really about kind of, how do you nurture this thing, you know, in any way that you can with the economic realities that you have to, sustain it year after year and not, not necessarily saying like, oh, because I haven't, become, you know, this crazy famous artist before I'm 30 means that I'm a failure. It's not, the amount of artists who I think, have become important and that we're just started realizing it, have been in their 60s or 70s. And that's not to say like you have to wait until that long, but it is a long arc to the career.
Yeah,
Okay. Right.
I probably sorry, no. You want to go?
No,
You want
no,
to
no, no, go.
go? Yeah, so I'll probably piggyback off of what Max says and probably add a little bit more into it is that what he said is right. You obviously, during these hard economic times, like we can't really, say where people is going to be at in their career, right? The only thing that I would say, the best suggestion that I would say is that if you are working in a part-time job, try to work a part-time job that's inside the industry. There's many other things than just becoming a studio assistant or working with a gallery. There's so many careers that's in the art. I'm actually a product of it, right? I didn't start out as an art advisor. I actually started out as an intern at Sotheby's, right? Where I was just like doing day-to-day stuff, either hanging stuff, I learned how to hang, right? So I was like, installer, right? But I also, put the viewing room together, right? I learned these things working inside institutional space like Sotheby's where I didn't think I was going to be an advisor at first, right? So I think the same thing in our world, like, you can apply to a museum and work, administrative job, because working there, you don't know who you bump into. And then it gives you time to have access again to these things that we're talking about, right? I always tell people like I didn't go to school for what I did, but Sotheby's was my school. So it was like I was getting paid and learning how the whole industry worked at the same time. So when I was ready to start my career, I knew what what exactly to do, what rooms to be in, who to talk to, all these other things. But I knew that I needed to be in a space like that because, yeah, you could go to school, but the schools is not going to teach you that, right? You got to learn these things in real time. So, and that goes into learning again, learning how to price your work, right? You being in these places, you're going to learn these things, right? It's going to become natural, right? Or learning how to, build an estimate of how much materials that you need, how much money you need to spend on materials, right? All these things you're gonna learn that from working with a gallery, right? So I think that if you are working a part-time or doing something, that it should still kind of be in the sector of where you want to go because your part-time is leading up to your full-time, and your full-time is your career, your practice.
I feel like also it's it's mind-boggling how many things there are happening concurrently. How many things there are to see, how many things there are to do, professionally, how many emails there are to write, all the things. And no one else can watch out for that except for you. Um, and it's not going to be that you're not going to find your way because people are saying kind of like, oh, but let's give that person another chance. I'm being really cruel here for a second, but like I think maximizing what those times are that you might take towards these things. I do, I know Max has said this already, but like your idea of like in an hour of administrative work, great. I think, just sitting down and getting that done, but also like, okay, you know, you should be at, there are certain nights where you can tell, at least again in New York, that a certain district that has galleries, there are going to be 15 openings. It's not going to happen next Thursday. It's just happening this Thursday. Make it a priority to get to the things that feel most important if your time is limited. And I completely agree. I mean, as somebody working in an arts nonprofit, I've certainly had lots of people who I've worked with and who have worked for me who have said, like, can I this time take 2 weeks as, a vacation together because I got a residency, right? And I also think that the places that surround themselves, with this type of work are going to probably be the most sympathetic to like working with you on certain things too.
That's great. Julianne, any other questions?
We mentioned that you would visit artists in their living space, and living and studio space is getting ever more expensive in our world. Is there any hesitancy on your part for entering into a studio space that say is in a living space with pets and partners or any of that?
No, I would say no. I think everyone is aware of kind of how artists, especially starting out, just don't have the means to, fund a 2,000 square foot plus studio and, you know, former warehouse or what have you. So I don't think anyone should feel ashamed that that's where they're working on. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to what art you're making and kind of like what, for my experience, what my reaction to it is, not, kind of, does the studio look pretty? Is it photographed well, etc.
All right, great. Well, we're almost to 8 o'clock. I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us tonight. Um, let's see, and to thank you to Julianne as well for monitoring our Q&A, and thank you to the audience at home who's been watching. I hope you've learned some great information to help you elevate your art career. Um, we have one more webinar next Thursday night with great art industry experts. So Julianne's going to put the registration link in the chat. So if you're interested, you can sign up for that. We'll also be posting the recordings of these webinars online, so you can watch them later. Last week's is already online at amoseno.org/elevate. And this one will be online probably sometime next week as soon as I get it up there. And we also have an in-person networking event at the gallery at 191 Henry Street on Thursday, June 26th from 5 to 8 p.m. Underdonk, which is another nonprofit gallery, which is located right next door to us, will be open late that night, as will a new gallery that's just been open for a few months, 2 doors down, McBride Dillman. And we're also going to be having some free drink tickets for the first 75 people who attend the event, courtesy of our restaurant partner right there, Betty. That registration link will also be in the Q&A. And again, you can find out all this information at amoseno.org/elevate. And if you found tonight's talk helpful or enjoy what Amos Eno Gallery is doing, even a small donation can help a nonprofit like us keep offering more free programs. So Julianne is sharing a donation link in the chat as well. Anything you can donate would be wonderful, but we totally understand if an artist is facing financial difficulties. And also, we're always looking for engaged, talented artists to join our community. If that sounds like you can find out more information about joining Amos Eno Gallery at amoseno.org/membership. And thank you all so much once again, everyone. Good night, and please enjoy the wonderful weekend. Good night, everybody.
Everyone.
Right now.
Bye.
Thank you.